I've got a question that might seem straightforward, but it's actually way more complicated and fascinating than it appears at first glance. Sometimes, the act of asking the question is more intriguing than the answer itself. So when does history begin? My initial response would be to say that history begins when writing begins. That seems like a simple and logical starting point, and it's probably what most people would assume. After all, we generally distinguish between ancient history and prehistoric times. But there's actually a lot of debate buried in that assumption. Does that mean any culture without writing is considered prehistoric, even if they exist today? Does a society enter history the moment they make contact with a culture that can write? And what about stories that were passed down orally and only written down centuries later? Many of the ancient accounts we rely on today have been filtered through generations of transcription, often changing in the process. In some cases, only secondary sources have survived, and that raises serious questions about the accuracy of what we think we know. It's a deeply complex issue. History, by its very nature, carries significance for everyone, but we don't necessarily assign the same weight to prehistoric times. I tend to define history as the story of us, humanity. In fact, the word story itself comes from the same Greek root as history. If history is a story, then it stands to reason that if there's no story to tell, there's no history. But calling something prehistoric is essentially saying that there's no story to tell about those people, which is a pretty bold claim. Some argue that artifacts and oral traditions are enough to constitute history, but if we go down that path, we open the door for mythology to be considered history as well. Since we can't always separate myth from reality without primary sources, we end up in a tricky spot. Either we accept myths as history, or we exclude cultures that lack writing. Neither option is ideal. Let's take a specific example, the Iroquois Confederacy. According to oral tradition, a man named Hiawatha united the Iroquois tribes and established peace long before European contact. The story wasn't written down until Europeans documented it centuries later. Most historians agree that Hiawatha was a real historical figure in some capacity, but we don't have any direct evidence beyond oral accounts. So, does the founding of the Iroquois Confederacy count as history, legend, or something in between? The story doesn't contain overtly supernatural elements, apart from some prophecy-like details about the great peacemaker, which we can disregard in the same way we downplay the prophetic warnings about Julius Caesar and the Ides of March. The story seems plausible, which is why many historians take it seriously, but ultimately, it requires faith rather than hard evidence. This brings us to another challenge historians have grappled with for centuries. Traditional historians often dismissed oral traditions as unreliable and claimed that Iroquois history only began when Europeans recorded it. This belief stems from the idea that history depends on written records, and since writing is one of the last components of what defines a civilization, history, by this view, is the exclusive domain of civilized societies. But more recent scholarship questions this assumption. The old-school definition of civilization required three main elements: agriculture, bureaucracy, and cities. Writing was often considered essential to this model, but civilizations like the Inca challenged that idea. The Inca had sophisticated record-keeping methods, a complex administrative system, and large cities, but they didn't have a traditional writing system. Does that mean they weren't part of history? Under this older framework, cultures without writing were labeled as primitive or savage if they were absorbed by civilizations, and as barbarian if they invaded from outside. But these classifications are problematic. First, calling people savages is obviously not a great look. Second, it's an oversimplification. There's a huge spectrum of societal development between the extremes of civilized and barbaric. For instance, the Mongols, often referred to as barbarians, actually had their own form of writing. So clearly, the definitions aren't as clear-cut as they might seem. This haziness extends to the origins of recorded history itself. We often say history begins with the earliest known writing systems, which would take us back to Sumer in the 4th millennium BCE. If we need a hard date, that's probably our best bet. But even here, we run into issues. Many documents from this era haven't survived, and we also have symbols that predate Sumerian writing, though we can't decipher them. Time has a way of erasing memory. Some might argue that the first real historical period begins with the formation of the First Empire, Sargon of Akkad's empire in the 24th century BCE. Others might suggest that true history starts with historiography, the practice of writing history, which would push the date much later, to figures like Herodotus in the 5th century BCE. Herodotus is often called the first historian, though even in his time, he was accused of being a storyteller rather than a strict recorder of facts. The Chinese also began writing historical records around this period, though their most famous historical works wouldn't appear until later. A more modern approach, called Big History, attempts to sidestep the prehistory problem by broadening the definition of history to include natural history, incorporating fields like paleontology, anthropology, evolutionary biology, and even cosmology. But this approach has its own issues. While it expands the scope of history, it often loses the human narrative, making it feel more like a lecture on periodization than a compelling story. In contrast, historians like Will and Ariel Durant focused on telling a grand narrative, but that approach inevitably brings us back to the old civilization-centric problem. Ultimately, there's no single answer to when history begins. As with many historical debates, the further back we go, the more legend and fact blur together. As the saying goes, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. If we define history strictly by the written word, then we could say it begins around 3500 BCE. But in reality, history resists easy definitions. The past is never as clear-cut as we'd like, and the boundaries between history, legend, and prehistory are far more fluid than they seem.